and welcome to this episode of G220 Radio. I am Mike, and I have with me this week Nathaniel, and Ricky isn't feeling good. While he is listening to us live, he is not going to be a part of the show, so you're going to pray for him. And I just want to apologize before we kind of get introductions that not advertising. I've been doing that as of recently, and I started a new job on Monday. So kind of working some of the kinks out to make sure that we get back to all of that. It was kind of all of a sudden. I interviewed last week, and they called me Friday and like, hey, can you start Monday? So, which is a praise for my family that we've been going through. So that's new with me. How are you doing, Nathaniel?
I'm doing good. This week we finished up the campus ministry for the fall. I will be indisposed next week, and after that it's probably going to be cold. So that's done. I'm probably going to go into my winter quarters and get some studying done and some fundraising that I need to get done so that I can expand hopefully in the spring and do it more days a week on campus or at the abortion clinic, wherever I need to be.
So you are planning on going to the Super Bowl. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah, it's exciting. I'm going to the Super Bowl in February to preach the gospel, not at the halftime show. So that'd be cool, but that's not what it is. I'm going with Sports Fan Outreach, and a friend of the show, Jason Saab, who's been on once before, asked me earlier this year to be on his team for that. So I told him I would, and I was kind of nervous because I mean, that's kind of pricey, registration fees or costs or however you say it, and the plane ticket and everything. So exciting story this week. I get home from campus ministry the other day, wrapping that up, and I check my email, and a donor who I don't recognize the name of donated $725. Just like two people had donated, and someone just met the rest of it, and that was just like really exciting for God to use His people to do that. So that was one of the really exciting thing that happened this week. Lots of exciting things have been happening to me this week so far.
Great. So are you still accepting more donations for the Super Bowl, or you just that's it?
Actually, that's probably gonna be it for that. But if you enjoy what I do and think it's a worthwhile cause, especially the campus stuff, you can go to refglobal.org. That is Romeo Echo Foxtrot Global.org. You can go to the evangelist section, click on candidates, and my profile's there with a giving link. So trying to raise around $6,000, because then I'll be able to take out $1,000 a month, and I'll have that little backup there in it. And I don't know how much self-promotion you want me to do on the podcast, but what you really need whenever you're raising support for a ministry is monthly supporters. So if you can only give like $5 a month, that's even appreciated. Every little bit helps.
Okay. So those who are led to help our friend here, Nathaniel.
Yeah, make sure you met your church commitments first.
Yeah.
I mean, always support your local church first. I mean, I'm just some guy
real person.
Yeah, I'm a real person, and I really do real work for God, but support your pastor first.
So, and as you guys know, here at G220 Radios, we have real conversations with real people from a biblical perspective, and that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be finishing up Proverbs 6. Last week was just Proverbs 6, so this week is Proverbs 6 and the consequences of adultery. That's the kind of final 15 chapters dealing with it. And while we could say this has other applications within just sexual immorality, it is very pointed at here in adultery and exposing the consequences and what would happen, but also how you stay away from that with it. So we have a whole slate to talk about. And since I read last week, Nathaniel,
I'll be the reader.
You can read this week. And we don't have any fancy PowerPoints like we had last week. I'm sorry.
That's all right. You're working hard in the grind. You've hit back to the grind.
Yeah.
As a joke, because you're in the coffee business now.
I do a lot of grinding.
All right. Verse 20, starting. Let's go down to around, what do you say, 24 to start?
Yep.
All right. My son, observe the commandment of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. Bind them continually to your heart. Tie them around your neck. When you walk about, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. And when you wake, they will talk to you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is a light. And the reproofs for discipline are the way to life, to keep you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress.
So we can see here something that's common in this first part. We've seen it repeatedly. The admonition of my son with some sort of command. And we've seen this one before. Keep your father's commandments and forsake not your mother's teachings. And so this is, when we think about this, the basis of, here in verse 20, when dealing with adultery specifically, but sin in general, in this case, is that the importance of parents to biblically teach their kids the commandments and the wisdom, and in that way, but also the equal obligation of children to learn from their parents the commandments and the wisdom for it. So there's the both ways. It's hard. I mean, my daughter, for some strange reason right now, decides that everything we've taught her no longer applies to her. And rules that she knows she's not supposed to break, she's decidingly now to just break them. And so there's, in a real sense in my life, trying to get my daughter to think about the commandments, the laws. What does it mean to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right? From Ephesians 6:1. What does that look like in it? And so we see here kind of right off the bat, the father telling his son, listen to your parents. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right.
Right. So this would, something that reminds me of is the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long in the land that I'm giving you. And we know that Paul quotes this commandment as the first commandment with a promise. So we see that when we honor our father and our mother, as you added the caveat almost, but in the Lord. So when our father and our mother give us godly wisdom or wisdom, though they may not be godly themselves, that matches, that would be wisdom, true wisdom, that would be in line with biblical precepts. Those kinds of commandments will protect our lives. That's what we see in this passage. Is that the commandment that Solomon is giving here serves a purpose to protect the son from something. And so honoring our father and our mother has something that comes from it. It's not it's not just a duty that you do. Just like every commandment that God has a purpose, it's for our good.
Yeah. And really, when we think of these first two verses together, so you have this, obey the commands from your father, don't forsake your mother's instructions. And then this idea of binding them, bind them on your heart always, tie them around your neck. There is this idea of adornment with it, but also to consider in relation. So Proverbs is not isolated in the canon. It comes after Deuteronomy. And when we think about the great, the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. You should bind them as a sign on your hands. They should be in the front lips between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your home and your gates. Now, obviously, Jews have taken this too far with flackeries, and they literally have the Shema in a piece of paper, and they wear it on their forehead, or they have them on their hands. And, it can be, I guess, taken that way, but more the wisdom it gives is this idea that it is constant and it's with you. And so thinking of Deuteronomy 6 and the backdrop as Solomon is thinking about things, he is considering the wisdom. God has given him wisdom, and he's thinking about these things. He's writing these proverbs down. And so he starts out with this, through the inspiration, with this idea of, okay, my son, don't forget the teachings I've given you, the commandments I've taught you, and the thing that I am told to do in Deuteronomy 6, I am now telling you to do, to bind them to your heart, to tie them around your neck, to live with them. And again, you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they'll watch over you. When you're awake, they'll talk with you. And this almost is a sense that this wisdom command takes a godlike overseeing. And in a way we can say, God's laws, these are God's wisdom and commandments. And so there's a sense in which they carry those attributes with them, coming from him, because he is good, they are good. But that there's this idea of life, that walking in biblical wisdom, walking according to the commandments, forsaking sin, brings life.
Right. And the thing I noticed about this too is that this wisdom that he's imparting is active. It's an active role. You mentioned earlier that the child's responsibility and the learning. But what we see here is this is a very active thing. Observe the commandments. We have it in the negative, don't forsake, bind them, tie them. And so in order for these commandments to be of benefit to the hearer, just like any part of the Bible, in the gospel, even you must take hold of it. It must become yours in a sense. It's no good if your parents have a faith, if your dad's in, if you think about it in a speaking in terms of the flesh, it's no good for me if my dad's a hard worker. It's no good for me if my dad's a businessman. If I don't take hold of that and make it my own, if I don't become a hard worker, and become industrious, then it means nothing that was my dad's lifestyle. And it's the same way with the faith. If I don't seize upon this, if I don't observe the commandment, if I don't forsake, or if I do forsake the teaching of my mother, if I don't bind them and tie them in the sense that I keep them near and dear to my heart through reading and meditation, then they are of no effect to me. And so it's a very active thing that we are responsible for, in a sense.
Yeah. And you see with that the closeness, and then the protection it provides.
Right.
That when a person embraces biblical wisdom and observes the commandments rightly, not to gain favor with God but instead because of what God has done for them,
right,
and to live accordingly, because of his great mercy towards them, we see that when the commandments are with them, they lead. They watch, they talk with you. There's that interaction, the protection, as I mentioned earlier. And then it gives kind of this grounding cause, which you have with the four. For the commandments is a lamp, and the teaching a light. Reproof of disciplines are the way of life. And ultimately, and what he's going to lead into is then it preserves you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress.
right.
And again, this imagery shows up over again in the Psalms, talking about the law and how it's a lamp unto my feet. With it guides us. It helps us. And when we obey the commandment, there's that push towards life. That even if you're walking wrongly, it says here, the reproof of discipline are the way of life. So even though you may not always follow the commandments, reproof and repentance brings you back. It restores the relationship and it brings back life with it. And so, you have the antinomians on one side that throw out the law. It's no good. It's not worth it. Antinomian is basically not the law.
Right.
They fall short because the commands to obey God, in a sense, have a duty and a law and a commandment to be followed. The legalist on the other side, you do it to gain favor, to win merit, to be saved with it. Where here what we're seeing is, look, you need to obey. But in the context of Israel, as the moral law states, I, the Lord, who took you out of Egypt, out of the bondage of slavery.
Right.
They are to now do these commands. And so even in Proverbs, we see this understanding. Look, we're called to obey because we're God's people. When you don't obey, you can still find life in God and in mercy. But not only do they light your way and to go, and when you fall, you can come back, you can also be preserved. It can save your life. It can save you from the devastation of sin and the consequences of sin when you do it. There are always consequences to sin. And walking in the law, walking in the light of God, and to seeking to please Him with an obedient life because of what He's done for you, preserves you from suffering for sin that you commit, because you won't commit sin, ideally. Now, we have to cup that with the fact that we still have sin reigning in our bodies, that we still do sin. But to understand, we will face those consequences, but we still need to repent and trust in the Savior. And just as discipline works with a kid, when my daughter disobeys or when my son disobeys, they receive discipline, and they're then called to come and confess their sins to me, or their disobedience, and seek forgiveness. And the same thing as we see here is called.
Right. Yeah, and it's very important how you've highlighted uh the position. We know as Christians that our position is in Christ, and so we see that even here. He doesn't say, young man, if you would like to be my son, observe these commandments. He says, my son. So the the audience of this is already has the position of son, just as we would have as Christians. We would have the position of ones who have been born not of the human decision or a husband's will, but born of God, who have been called sons of God. And so we work out of that position through the third use of the law, trying to please God. And then through the law, He also brings us repentance and reproof, and directs us. And sometimes we have chastisement from the Lord, discipline, as a father disciplines a son. And yet we always must remember our position as sons in Christ.
Yeah. And we see here in verse 24, and moving into that, really what Solomon is moving towards is just not nice platitudes and this kind of high theory,
Right.
but really a very important topic, not only, I mean, for us in America and Western culture today,
Right.
but a problem that was important enough even in his time to make sure his son knew specifically,
Right.
with adultery, and not just kind of how, let me get my catechism up here. So what the Baptist catechism, and I'm assuming the Westminster has something similar with it, when dealing with this seventh commandment, with it, that, we see it, that the seventh, what is required in the seventh commandment, this is question 76 in the Baptist Catechism. We have the seventh commandment, which is, thou shalt not commit adultery. The seventh commandment requires the preservation of our own and our neighbor's chastity in heart, speech, and behavior. So, obviously, this, when we think of what is required with it, we've expanded it, and a lot of it because Jesus expanded it, that there is much more than just the act of adultery, which is being in the commandment. So while there's all of that with it, we should realize here that Solomon is dealing with just the actual act of adultery, taking someone else's wife. And the importance of to making sure that you do not go to this evil woman, this smooth tongue of the adulteress, and just the imagery. Sometimes you'll have the language of like a tongue like kind of dripping with honey, the sweetness, this woman that sounds really nice. She sounds really good. But Solomon is really showing us that this woman looks nice on the outside, but she is dead in the inside. She is corrupt. Maybe a better way to say is how Jesus said it. She's a whitewashed tomb. In that way. And so all of this understanding of keeping the commandments and making sure you're binding them, all of it leads, while it affects all other sins in general, as we've been talking, Solomon is bringing all of that to bear on this one particular sin, and maybe in some irony for us knowing kind of just his own lifestyle, having 900 wives, having 1,200 concubines, and kind of his, his own life. But just because he may not reflect exactly what this is, the Spirit has inspired him to write it, and we should take it seriously and not to just discard what he has to say about adultery.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of the stuff that we've seen this character before. If any of our listeners go back and check our coverage of Proverbs 5, we already met this character before, and she's getting more what's the word, more airtime, I guess, now, as we move in the latter portion of chapter 6 and into 7. We see her appear again, because it was a reoccurring problem in Solomon's life. I just finished reading First Kings and moving into Second Kings, but it was a problem for Solomon. He had many wives who led him astray after the foreign gods. At the beginning of his reign, it says he still pinched incense at the high places, and as he was tempted through sexual immorality, you can see some of that in Ecclesiastes played out, at least his thought process of chasing folly. And then in Kings, it says it gives the astronomical amount of wives he had, somewhere around 700 women in his harem. And they all led him after foreign gods, even gods like Moloch, who you may be familiar with, is the god that they would do infant sacrifices to. So some of these wicked Canaanite deities, and it really was at the behest of his wife. So the adulterous woman, or even the unbelieving woman, will lead you into places you never thought you'd go. And we see that again at the end of First Kings with Ahab. He was from the house of Omri, and he was one of the most wicked kings the northern kingdom of Israel had. And a lot of a lot of the wickedness. If there's an event where he kills a man because he coveted his vineyard, or it was a wicked scheme. Had a couple of scoundrels, which we covered last week, a couple of scoundrels to play out this wicked scheme to kill a man, and this was all concocted by his unbelieving wife, Jezebel. And so we see that throughout the scriptures, the adulterous woman or the unbelieving wife leads the who's otherwise supposed to be part of God's covenant people, leads them astray into untold wickedness.
Yeah. So let's go ahead, move to
what's my next chunk to orate for you.
25 through. It's hard. It all kind of
flows together.
Let's go to 25 through 28.
All right. Do not desire her beauty in your heart, nor let her capture you with her eyelids. For on account of the harlot, one is reduced to a loaf of bread, and an adulteress hunts for the precious life. Can a man take fire in his bosom, and his clothes not be burned? Or can a man walk on hot coals and not scorch his feet?
So we see.
Yeah,
go ahead. You can do it.
So it is. So is it with the one who goes into his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her will not go unpunished.
So what we see here. So obviously, verse 24 introduces this evil woman, the adulteress. He elaborates. Don't desire her beauty in her heart. We see this with the sin of David with Bathsheba. He saw that she was beautiful. And so, and I don't know how well acquainted Solomon is with the sin of his father with his mother at that time, when he's writing this. But you see that idea. Don't desire her beauty in your heart. And, Jesus, isn't probably alluding to this, but he makes it. What is adultery? Well, it's lust in your heart. It's desiring something that you don't want. So Solomon here telling his son, God telling us, don't desire the beauty of the adulterer. Don't be captured by her eyelashes. Don't go after the beauty. Don't think it's more, because the price of a prostitute here in the ESV is only a loaf of bread. And so you see that, you're like, okay, but the contrast is a married woman hunts down a precious life. And that there is a sense, not Solomon is going, advocating for prostitution, but that if you're captured by the adulterous beauty and you commit the sin of adultery, she ruins your life. Isn't it just like, if you would just go to a prostitute, which is sin, let be clear about that. As much as that seems their trite, that trying to think of good ways to say this, so sorry for all the long pauses. That, there's almost maybe a seriousness with the adultery in sin, not only the breaking of the covenant between the wife and her husband, even though she's the one seducing, um, but that even her son, who may not even be married, is going to be haunted by the acts of adultery for his life. There is a sense in which he will never recover from such an act with a married woman.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It's the thing that I notice about all this is that we know that a man stores up or pours evil out of his mouth from the evil treasure stored up in his heart, and good out of the good treasure stored up in his heart. And so when we start this section we read, um, it starts with the heart, like you indicated. The heart is the seat of all sin. Um, the reason we sin isn't because we are tempted, but as James says, someone is tempted as he is carried away by his own desires. And so if we treasure the idea of a tryst, or an affair in our heart, then how much easier will it be once a beautiful woman, uh, even one off limits, how much easier would it be for us to just go along with it once we've already treasured this in our heart, that we could commit sexual immorality? And like you said, this great gravity that accompanies that. Um, it's one thing. There's a certain level of of heinousness to fornication with someone out on the street, whether it's just a, any act of fornication. There's a certain level of heinousness, but whenever you go to rob another man's house, to take someone that belongs to another man, you mentioned the covenant between them that is broken whenever you do this. And so um, it's ultimate covetousness of desiring that which is not yours. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And that's exactly what is breaking all. It's running the gambit of whoever breaks one of these commandments is guilty of breaking them all. And the adulteress hunts for a precious life. So this is, like you said, it will affect you your whole life, because in a lot of cases, I'm assuming that adultery will take place where perhaps the husband against whom you're sinning. If you think about Uriah was one of David's mighty men, and who David had done battle with. He had gone to battle and fought alongside Uriah, and so that adultery fractured that relationship and ruined that relationship. And then just moving into 27, a lot of times we think that we can play at sin or see how close we can get, even in the Christian walk. How close can I get to this fire without getting burned? Instead of saying, what must I do to please God, we say, what's the most I can get away with? And a lot of times in the Christian life, whether it's the case of adultery, something extremely heinous, that ruins families, or something minor, in comparison, we ask ourselves, what's the closest I can get to the fire without being burned? And yet it says, can a man take fire in his bosom and not get burned? In his clothes not get burned or smell like smoke? I mean, when we play at sin, when we wink at sin and treasure it, store it up in our heart, we will get burned. And it is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And so when we play with his fire, it's dangerous business.
Yeah. And you can note here that the author Solomon in verse 29 really gives us the answer to those questions. I mean,
Right,
if we didn't have verse 29, the answer is obvious. No.
right,
A man cannot carry fire next to his chest and his clothes not be burned. No. Um, he can't walk on hot coals and his feet not get scorched. Like, those answers are obvious. You're going to
right,
have fire in chest, your clothes are going to start on fire. So then he makes that implication. So is he who goes into his neighbor's wife. None who touches her will go unpunished. That the seriousness of adultery makes it where one does not feel, that makes it where one will feel the consequences of their sin. There is
right,
no way to get around how that is. They will be punished
right.
for what they have done. And when we think about that, that even kind of carries today, even how kind of free we are in our sexuality in the Western culture. Adultery is still seemingly considered wrong. Like, you don't have people trying to change the stigma of adultery. Now, there might be some who do. And, and sometimes you'll see like couples agree maybe to see other people or something like that. But if it's not, I guess, approved by both parties in our culture, that there is that still that stigma.
Mm-hmm.
Politicians lose their positions because of adulterous affairs they have while in position. And it hurts them even in this day of age,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not in a case of sexual harassment, with it. And so I think, drawing on that, we see that there is a sense, when we read Romans 2 and we understand that the Gentiles also having a conscience know the laws of God, with it, that the seventh commandment is still seen to be something you don't break, rightly so, for it. And so we should consider that even non-Christians see the importance of not committing adultery. So we who do believe should be all the more understanding about the dangers of having adultery, especially those who lead the church, which you hear it all the time
Mm.
about pastors who do not guard themselves.
Right,
And this is a real thing that even in seminary, I mean, this is talked about regularly. I had a class on pastoral ministry, and the professor, who is also a full-time um, pastor at a church, he's the head pastor, preaching pastor. He told us a story. The first thing he did when he went to the church that he's currently at was change the door. It was a solid door. He made him change the door to put glass in it, so at all times people could
mm-hmm.
see what was happening in his office.
Right,
And, you know, there are good and godly pastors who think that way,
right,
but there's others that don't. And we see it. Trillian Trevigen as probably an example of it in more recent times, and kind of a bigger name. And so, and I mean, so much so that even as a pastor, like, this is disqualifying.
right.
you commit adultery, you basically have disqualified yourself from the ministry at all. And this
Right.
is the seriousness with it, because sin doesn't go unpunished.
Right.
You will face the consequences, and especially when it comes to adultery, which is kind of where he leads to now, kind of in the rest of the last part of the chapter.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's definitely something that you have to take. Whenever I first started law school, it was during the orientation. They had an ethics seminar, or whatever it was, and one of the attorneys said that in terms of ethics and what we'd think of as morality, obviously from a scriptural standpoint, or even biblical ethics, you have to make the decision to do the right thing before the time of choosing ever comes. And that's exactly what you highlighted, with the pastor who changed his door so that everyone could see inside, or like my pastor has a policy where he will not counsel women alone. Either his wife's going to be at the church or whatever, so that he has that safeguard. And that's something as men, especially men involved in any capacity of ministry, you have to have those safeguards in place. And just to add on to that, as we move into verse 30 to the end, men do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he is hungry, but when he is found, he must repay sevenfold. He must give all the substance of his house. The one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who would destroy himself does it. Wounds and disgrace he will find, and his reproach will not be blotted out. For jealousy enrages a man, and he will not spare in the day of vengeance. He will not accept any ransom, nor will he be satisfied though you give him many gifts.
Yeah. And so we get kind of to the pinnacle of it. Follow the commands, preserve your life. If you don't, and you commit adultery specifically,
Right.
well, there is no end to your punishment. Really is what it goes. And he starts off with this story about a thief. Thief steals some food to satisfy his appetite. If he's caught, he repays for what he's stolen and the penalty for it. Kind of the sevenfold aspect. And he loses all of his stuff.
Right.
Is this thing. This is not what happens when someone commits adultery.
Right.
And is found out. You see it. He lacks sense. He's foolish. He's dumb. And he destroys himself. We think about the thief. The thief loses his stuff, but he's not destroyed.
Right.
He can get more stuff. He can work and able to get food. The one who commits adultery doesn't have that opportunity.
Right.
They destroy themselves. They've ruined their life. And you see it. He's dishonored. His disgrace will never be walked away. Once you do it, you're it. Once you've committed adultery, you're an adulterer. There's nothing around it. And even when you have that own bad name, you have now to deal with the husband who has a jealousy for his wife. Rightly so. He is to be jealous for his wife. It is his wife And he has made a covenant with her. That's why marriage is kind of used a lot, and adultery is used a lot, and for about Israel's
Mm-hmm.
breaking covenant with God. Hosea is about
Right.
that. There is a right jealousy a husband has for his wife when a person, and understandingly, the woman is not kind of passive in this. Like, it's her sin too.
Right.
As we may have not have developed that as well. Really, she's the one seducing in
Right.
a sense with this. So she's not completely passive in this. She is definitely active um, with it. But this is to the son, so that's been the focus for it. That the husband is not going to take it light when it comes to revenge.
Right.
He's going to be upset. He's going to be angry. And he's going to do whatever he can to ruin your life, even if you try to give him gifts because of what you have done. This is the destruction of adultery.
Right.
And to do it shows your stupidity, to
Amen.
put it one way, your foolishness, and almost this kind of disdain for life. For it. This isn't, you can't do what Jacob does when he comes back to the promised land after being away, after having 2 wives and 4 wives and 12 children, and trying to appease his brother for stealing his birthright and his thing. That's not going to work with a husband when you've committed adultery with his wife.
Right. It's not, no. And I mean, I always seem to know exactly where I'm going to take it to. When you mentioned Hosea, um, because that's exactly what we see. We can see shadows of the divine here. The way he treats his bride, those who commit adulteries and harlotries with Israel, the Arameans, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, all the ites. We don't have any more Hittites. We don't have any more Assyrians. We don't have any more Romans. Even God wiped out the Canaanites. Though he was had a sore displeasure for his bride, his covenant people, Israel. Um, he, there are no more of those other people. I've never met a Hittite. God wiped them out, and so we see that play out on a divine level. That the husband's jealousy is a consuming fire, and whenever you go into your neighbor's house like this and rob him, it is more than a thief. A thief takes something replaceable. Your wife's chastity, once her honor has been offended, that cannot be restored. You can't just go out and buy another chastity. Um, that's ruined. It's an action that you cannot take back. There are certain sins that you can make restitution for, like it says, he must repay sevenfold. But this is one of those. This is a we would say there's no restitution here, which is why in the law, in the Torah, we see that this is a death penalty offense, because there is no means of making this offended husband whole. There is no way of rectifying the situation, and so the only way for justice to be served is through purging the evil from your camp. And that's what it says. Your reproach won't be blotted out. He won't accept anything on the day of vengeance. You will not be spared. And though we live in a licentious society, the same sort of thing follows. If you are in a circle with a certain person, and then you commit this act with his wife, you are torched from that circle, and heaven forbid you're a pastor who has committed this. You torpedoed your church essentially, and God willing, your church will survive. But if you're in a position of authority over anything, and you are the personality, as it were, who leads and guides guides that organization or that church with your hand, you are making a decision to torpedo your organization and harm a lot of people. Not to mention the husband who will not. I mean, we have Christ now, and so someone who has this happen to them, the husband who is a Christian, who has found redemption and forgiveness in Christ, obviously should be able to think of what Christ has done. That doesn't change the hurt and remove the consequences. But even so, just the immense pain that you bring upon someone when you do something like this.
Yeah. And to note, we've kind of directed it more of kind of a man with someone else's wife.
Right.
But realize the context is Solomon writing to his son.
Right.
And that's the context. That what he is saying here applies to any type of adultery, and we would expect on the flip side.
Right.
That is, if a man commits adultery, his wife should be upset with the woman, with her husband, with it, and would have the same type of punishment and consequences with it.
Right.
To understand that. So this is, obviously in understanding the context of the book, Proverbs is written from Solomon to his son, that this does apply outside of that, and working. And so that adultery is, no matter who's involved, destructive, and it will ruin your life.
Right.
I mean, so when I was growing up, you've had the whole Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton aspect. And even 20 years later, Monica Lewinsky's name is tarnished with this act with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's name is tarnished because of this also. And maybe you can say with other things too, with it. But there's still that understanding. Our current president has tarnishes because of some of the same sins, with it. This is, and, we're not trying to be, anti-president or anti-Trump or whatever, just to understand, like, the seriousness of this sin.
Right.
With it. It comes with baggage. It comes with consequences that, as you said, just can't be dealt with. Like the thief that can repay what he's stolen, unlike the thief that can repay what he has stolen, adultery completely destroys everything. And so, as we come up here now to about an hour, that's kind of the application. Adultery destroys. Don't do it. Let the commands of God and obedience to him, because of his great mercy and grace towards you, preserve you from destroying your life from adultery.
Right. It's they're They're a lamp, and the commandments are a lamp, and the teaching is life, or is light, and the reproofs for discipline are the way of life. The Proverbs later will tell us that those who hate wisdom love death, and that's what we see here. The one who spurns the rebuke of his father, as we saw in earlier chapters, I believe 5. The one who spurns the rebuke of the father has terrible, terrible hurt and pain waiting for him. If you can't, we've quoted the great Reverend before, the man in black, Johnny Cash. You can run on for a long time, but God will cut you down. God will take everything into account, every deed, whether done in secret or done in the open, and you will pay, either today or on that day. It's just no good. In Proverbs, we always see something to run toward. We saw that at the beginning of the chapter, run toward the light of the commandment. And we see something to run away from adultery, run away from sexual immorality. Paul says, flee sexual immorality. And so as you go through the Proverbs, look for what you are to run toward, so that in running toward that thing, you will be running away from that which destroys you.
So that has been our episode. Today was episode 402, Proverbs 6, the consequences of adultery. So we covered the second part of Proverbs 20 through 35 in our episode today. Just to remind you that every Tuesday at 9 p.m. we record live on YouTube primarily, but if we can, we also try to post it on Facebook. You can also catch our podcast when they drop on Thursdays at 6 a.m. for you if you don't want to stare at our ugly mugs, which, I don't blame you. So
I don't mind staring at that face, Mike.
The awesomeness that springs from my face, as the bearded gospel man would say.
You were talking about my mug.
Oh,
okay.
I don't know. That's why I grow this, to make it more palatable. Although my wife would probably beg to differ.
I can't hide behind a beard. I get it looks stupid. It looks like one of those. I cut my dog's hair earlier this week, and I couldn't do it by myself, and he had just had a horrible haircut, and that's what I look like when I have a beard.
We'll get the fake ones from Party City.
That's it.
So, I am Mike. With me was Nathaniel. From all of us here at G220, we thank you for listening. And as George always says,
till we go home.